The red dust of Kepler 442b swirled around Hyen's boots as he walked home from another long day in the mining tunnels. His back ached from 12 hours of fixing broken machines, while alien overseers watched his every move. The hegemony guards always stood close, their dark eyes searching for any sign of trouble from the human workers. Hyen kept his face blank and his steps steady. He had learned long ago that showing emotion only brought pain. The aliens who ruled this world did not like it when humans looked too happy or too angry or to anything at all. They wanted workers, not people. The settlement where humans lived was a collection of gray metal boxes arranged in perfect rows. Each box held for people. Hyen shared his space with 3 other miners, but tonight they were working the late shift. This meant he could do what he really lived for. He pressed his thumb to the scanner and stepped inside. The room was small and cold, with 4 narrow beds and a single table. A weak light flickered overhead. Hyen moved to his bed and lifted the thin mattress. Hidden underneath was a small data pad and several sheets of real paper. Paper was illegal for humans to own. Writing was forbidden, but Hyen wrote anyway. He sat at the table and powered on the data pad. The screen glowed softly in the dim room. His fingers moved across the keys, and words began to appear. Words that told the truth about humanity. Words that the hegemony feared more than any weapon. Tonight, he was working on a story about the Battle of New Terra. The official hegemony records said that humans had surrendered quickly when the aliens arrived. They said humans were weak and grateful to be conquered. But Hyen knew the real story. His father had been there. The humans of New Terra had fought for 6 months against impossible odds. When their ships were destroyed, they fought from the ground. When their weapons ran out, they used tools and rocks. When the city fell, they kept fighting in the forests and mountains. Even when defeat was certain, they never stopped trying. To protect their families and their freedom, Hyen typed slowly, carefully choosing each word. He wrote about Captain Kim, who flew his damaged ship directly into an alien destroyer to save a refugee convoy. He wrote about Dr. Park, who stayed in the burning hospital to treat wounded civilians, even as enemy forces closed in. He wrote about the children who carried messages between resistance groups, running through dangerous streets because the adults could not move unseen. These were not the weak, pathetic humans that hegemony propaganda described. These were people who chose to fight even when they knew they would lose. People who valued honor and love more than their own lives. As Hyen wrote, he heard footsteps in the corridor outside. He quickly saved his work and hid the datapad. The footsteps passed by his door and continued down the hall. He waited several minutes before pulling out the device again. The hegemony had banned all human books, movies, songs, and stories. They said human culture was dangerous because it promoted individualism and rebellion. They were right to be afraid. Every human story was about someone who refused to give up, someone who fought against odds that seemed impossible to beat. Hyen had been collecting these stories for 3 years. He interviewed old soldiers and refugees in secret. He gathered accounts from humans who had lived through the conquest of dozens of worlds. Slowly, carefully, he was building a complete record of human courage and determination. His sister Nari helped him spread the stories. She worked on the cargo docks, loading and unloading the ships that carried supplies between star systems.
Yes.
Sometimes she hid copies of Hyen's writings in shipments bound for other worlds. It was incredibly dangerous. But other humans needed to know the truth about their own people. Just last week, Nari had brought him news from the factory world of New Sol. A group of young humans there had found one of his stories about the siege of Luna City. They were so inspired that they started their own resistance cell. They painted the names of human heroes on factory walls and left small acts of defiance for the alien supervisors to find. Hyen smiled as he remembered Neris's excitement when she told him. His words were making a difference. Humans across the galaxy were starting to remember who they really were. But tonight he was working on something different. Something bigger and more dangerous than anything he had written before. He called it the Unbroken Spirit, and it was not just one story, but hundreds of them, all woven together to show the truth about humanity, The book would explain why humans could not be truly conquered. It would show that every time the hegemony thought they had broken human resistance, it grew back stronger. It would prove that the human spirit was like water, always finding a way through the smallest crack. It's impossible to contain forever. He wrote about the human ability to adapt and survive. He described how humans had learned to thrive in space, on ice worlds, in desert colonies, and in the depths of gas giant atmospheres. No other species was so flexible, so determined to make any environment their home. He wrote about human creativity, the way humans could look at a problem and see solutions that other species missed. Human engineers had improved alien technology in ways the original designers never imagined. Human doctors had developed treatments that saved lives of many different species. Human artists created beauty that moved beings throughout the galaxy, even those who claimed to hate humanity. Most importantly, he wrote about human solidarity. When one human was in trouble, others would risk everything to help. When human communities were attacked, neighbors became family. When human worlds were threatened, strangers became brothers and sisters in arms. The hegemony understood this, which was why they worked so hard to keep humans isolated and afraid. They separated human families, moved workers constantly between different worlds, and punished any sign of human cooperation. But they could not change human nature. As the night grew deeper, Hune continued to write. His eyes burned from staring at the screen, but he pushed forward. Tomorrow he would return to the mines and pretend to be just another broken worker. But tonight, he was doing the most important work of his life. He was telling the truth. Somewhere in the galaxy, other humans were reading his words and remembering what it meant to be human. That was worth any risk, any sacrifice. Outside his window, the alien patrol ships moved across the sky like metal stars. They thought they owned this world, owned these people. They were wrong. The human spirit could never be truly owned. Never. Be completely broken. He saved his work and carefully hid the datapad again. Tomorrow, he would write more. Every day he would add to the growing collection of human stories. Every word was an act of rebellion, a small flame that would someday become a fire that burned across the entire galaxy. The Tyrants feared his pen more than they feared human weapons. They were right to be afraid. The factory sirens wailed across New Sol as Tay finished his shift at the metal processing plant. His hands were stained with oil, and his uniform was torn from catching on the machinery, but his mind was somewhere else entirely, hidden in his work locker was a small piece of paper that had changed everything. 3 days ago, a new worker had slipped him the paper during lunch break. The man had said nothing, just pressed it into Tay's palm and walked away. When Tay finally read it, that night he could barely believe what he saw. It was a story about humans who had fought back against the hegemony. Real humans, with real names, who had chosen courage over safety. The story was called The Siege of Luna City, and it told about Captain Kim, who had crashed his ship into an enemy destroyer to save innocent people. Tay read it over and over until he had memorized every word. For the first time in his life, he felt proud to be human. Tay was only 20 years old, but he had never known a world without alien rule. His parents told him stories sometimes about the time before the conquest, but they always spoke in whispers, and made him promise never to repeat what he heard. The hegemony had taught him that humans were weak and stupid. They needed alien guidance to survive. But this story showed something different. It showed humans who were brave and smart, and willing to sacrifice everything for what they believed in. If humans like Captain Kim had existed, maybe Tay could be like them too. He started looking for other workers who might be interested in hearing about real human heroes. He was careful at first, only talking to people he trusted completely. His Frande worked on the same production line and had always questioned why humans were treated so badly. His cousin Bach had gotten in trouble with the supervisors for asking, too, many questions about human history. One evening after work, Tay gathered these two friends in an abandoned storage room deep in the factory complex. With shaking hands, he pulled out the precious piece of paper and began to read the story aloud. Both men listened with growing amazement. This really happened, Day whispered when Tay finished reading. Humans really fought like this. We could fight like this, Bach added quietly. That was the beginning of their resistance cell. They started small, doing things that seemed harmless, but sent a message. They would leave tools in the wrong places to slow down production. They would accidentally break machines that were already old and dangerous. They painted the name Captain Kim on bathroom walls where the alien supervisors would see it. Word spread carefully through the factory. Workers began to whisper about the human heroes they had heard about. Production slowed as people became less willing to work extra hard for their oppressors. The alien supervisors noticed but could not figure out why their human workers were becoming so difficult. Meanwhile, on the other side of the galaxy, Mina sat in her office at the Hegemony Ministry of Information. Her job was to create propaganda that would keep conquered species happy with their situation. She was very good at her work, which made her valuable to her superiors. But lately, her job had become more challenging. Reports were coming in from across the galaxy about strange new ideas spreading among human populations. Humans were becoming less cooperative, more willing to question authority, more proud of their identity as humans. Her supervisor, a tall, gray alien named Vex, had given her a special assignment. She needed to study these new human writings and create counter-propaganda to stop their influence. He handed her a collection of papers that had been seized from various worlds. These human stories are causing problems, Vex explained. Find their weaknesses. Show why humans should not believe such foolish tales. Mina took the papers back to her desk and began to read. The first story was about the Battle of New Terra, written in simple but powerful language. It described human soldiers who kept fighting even when they knew they would lose, civilians who risked their lives to help strangers, and children who carried messages through dangerous streets. As she read, Mina felt something strange happening inside her chest. The stories were supposed to be propaganda, lies meant to make humans feel better about themselves. But they felt real in a way that her own propaganda never did. She had always been told that humans were conquered easily because they were selfish and cowardly. But these stories showed the opposite. They showed humans who put others before themselves, who faced impossible odds with determination, who never gave up hope even in the darkest moments. Mina read story after story, each one more impressive than the last. She learned about human scientists who had made breakthrough discoveries while living under terrible conditions. She read about human doctors who had saved the lives of alien patients even when those same aliens treated humans as second-class beings. She discovered accounts of human communities that had shared food during famines, protected each other during disasters, and maintained hope through decades of oppression. The more she read, the harder it became to concentrate on her real job. How could she write propaganda against people who showed such courage and kindness? How could she help keep these remarkable beings under the heel of the hegemony, 3 star systems away? Commander Zelak reviewed the latest security reports from his sector. The alien military officer had been fighting rebellions and resistance movements for 15 years, but something new was happening. The human uprisings were becoming more organized, more determined, and more successful. His troops had raided 17 suspected rebel hideouts in the past month. Each time, they found copies of the same human writings. The stories were spreading faster than his forces could stop them, and each new world that discovered them seemed to develop its own resistance movement within days. What worried Zelak most was that the stories were not just inspiring humans. His intelligence officers reported that other conquered species were beginning to read translated copies. Beings who had accepted hegemony, rule for decades, were suddenly asking questions about their own histories and heroes. Zelak called his senior staff together for an emergency meeting. The conference room was filled with officers from different alien species, all loyal servants of the hegemony. Maps of the troubled sectors covered the walls, marked with red dots, showing the locations of recent resistance activities. "The situation is getting worse," Zelak began. "These human writings are not just entertainment, they're instruction manuals for rebellion." His intelligence chief, a insect-like being named Vrex, clicked his mandibles nervously. The stories teach practical lessons about resistance tactics, but they also do something more dangerous. They make beings believe that fighting back is possible. What do you recommend? Zelok asked. More force, suggested his military advisor. We need to crack down harder on any world where these writings appear. But Zelek had tried that approach on 3 different worlds. Each time, the increased brutality had only proved the point that the human stories were making. The more violently, the hegemony responded. The more their subjects began to see them as the tyrants that the human writers described. Back on New Sol, Tay's resistant cell had grown to include 30 factory workers. They had moved beyond small acts of sabotage and were now planning something bigger. They had learned that a hegemony supply convoy would pass through their system next week, carrying weapons and equipment to reinforce the garrison on a nearby world. We could hit them when they stopped to refuel, Day suggested during one of their secret meetings. It's too dangerous, worried another member of the group. They will kill us all if we attack them directly. Tay looked around at the faces of his friends and fellow workers. A month ago, they had all been afraid to even speak loudly in the presence of alien supervisors. Now they were planning to attack a military convoy. The stories had changed them, just as they were changing humans all across the galaxy. Captain Kim knew it was dangerous when he crashed his ship, Tay said quietly. But he did it anyway because some things are more important than being safe. The room fell silent as everyone considered his words. Outside, they could hear the sounds of the night shift beginning their work, the same sounds they had heard every day of their lives. But inside this small room, something new was being born. Something that would soon spread far beyond the walls of a single factory on a DA. Forgotten world, the seeds of revolution had been planted. Soon they would grow into something that would shake the foundations of the galaxy. Nari crouched in the cargo hold of the transport ship Silent Runner, carefully placing small data chips inside hollowed-out medical supply containers. Each chip contained dozens of her brother's stories, compressed and encrypted to avoid detection by hegemony scanners. This shipment was bound for the mining colonies of the Vega system, where thousands of human workers labored under brutal conditions. Her hands moved quickly and efficiently. She had done this hundreds of times over the past year, but the danger never decreased. If the hegemony caught her smuggling forbidden writings, she would face immediate execution. But Nari had read every story her brother wrote, and she understood that some risks were worth taking. The ship's captain, an old human named June, appeared at the entrance to the cargo hold. His weathered face showed years of hardship under alien rule, but his eyes still held the spark of defiance that seemed to burn in every human who read Hyan's work. "The dock inspectors are coming aboard," June whispered. "You need to finish quickly." Nari sealed the last container and activated a small device that would scramble any scans of the medical supplies. The technology came from human engineers, who had secretly modified hegemony equipment, turning their own tools against them. It was another example of human creativity, finding ways to resist oppression. The inspection team consisted of 3 aliens and 1 human collaborator. Nari watched from her hiding spot behind a stack of metal crates as they moved through the cargo hold with their scanning devices. The lead inspector, a reptilian being with cold yellow eyes, seemed suspicious of everything. "These medical supplies," the alien hissed, pointing at the containers Nari had just finished preparing. "Why are there so many going to mining worlds?" The human collaborator, a thin man with nervous movements, checked his data pad. "There has been an increase in workplace injuries, sir. The miners are requesting more pain medication and bandages." "Humans are always complaining," the alien replied with disgust. "Scan everything twice." Nari held her breath as the scanning beams passed over the modified containers. The devices showed exactly what they were supposed to show: medical supplies and nothing more. After 20 tense minutes, the inspection team moved to another part of the ship. When they were gone, June helped Nari move the containers to a secure storage area. The old captain had been smuggling resistance materials for 2 years, ever since his grandson had been killed by hegemony guards for asking too many questions about human history. "How many worlds are we reaching now?" June asked as they worked. 47 systems, Nari replied proudly. "And the stories are being copied and spread faster than ever before. People are translating them into alien languages too." This was The most surprising development of all, human stories about human courage and resistance, were inspiring not just humans, but members of other species who lived under hegemony rule. Apparently, the desire for freedom was universal, and humans were teaching the galaxy that fighting back was possible. Meanwhile, in a hidden laboratory on the academic world of Kepler 186f, an alien scientist named Yenth studied translations of human writings with growing amazement. Yenth belonged to a species called the Keth, beings who valued knowledge above all else. The hegemony had conquered his people 50 years ago, but had allowed them to continue their research as long as it served military purposes. Yenth's official assignment was to study human psychology to help develop better methods of control. But the more he learned about humans, the more fascinated he became with their unique mental characteristics. His latest research focused on something he called adaptive resilience, a psychological trait that seemed to exist only in humans. Other species, when faced with overwhelming odds, would either fight until destroyed or surrender completely. Humans did something different. They would retreat, adapt, learn, and come back stronger. Remarkable, Yenth whispered to himself as he read another story about human resistance fighters. This particular tale described how a small group of humans had survived for 3 years on a world that the hegemony had declared completely pacified. They had learned to live in caves, grow food in hidden gardens, strike at alien outposts when least expected. Most impressive was how they had evolved their tactics over time. When energy weapons proved ineffective against hegemony armor, they had developed chemical explosives. When the aliens adapted their patrols to prevent ambushes, the humans had switched to sabotage. When sabotage became too dangerous, they had focused on spreading information and building support among the civilian population. Yenth compared this to the behavior of his own people. When the hegemony had conquered the Keth homeworld, most had simply accepted their fate. A few had fought briefly and been crushed. None had shown the human ability to continuously adapt and find new ways to resist. He was so absorbed in his research that he almost missed the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside his laboratory. Quickly, he hid the human writings and pulled up a fake research project on his computer screen. The door opened and his supervisor entered, a massive alien with 4 arms and skin like black stone. Yenth, the supervisor growled, "What progress have you made on the human control project?" "Very interesting developments, sir," Yenth replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I am discovering that humans have certain psychological weaknesses that could be exploited." "Explain." Yenth had prepared for this question. He pulled up a chart that showed human emotional responses to different stimuli. But as he spoke, he was careful to provide information that would be useless to the hegemony while appearing to be helpful. "Humans become very upset when separated from their families," he said. "This could be used to encourage compliance." What he did not mention was that this same emotional connection also made humans incredibly motivated to fight for each other's freedom. The supervisor listened to his report and left, apparently satisfied. When he was alone again, Yenth returned to his real research. He had begun writing his own analysis of human psychology, one that would eventually prove that humans represented an evolutionary breakthrough that other species could learn from rather than fear. Back on Kepler 4, for Tabihun worked by candlelight in a new hiding place. The hegemony had raided his old room 3 days ago, but June and other resistance members had helped him escape with his writings intact. Now he lived in an abandoned mining tunnel deep underground, protected by a network of humans who risked their lives to keep him safe. His latest work was different from his previous stories. Instead of just recording human history, he was now writing practical guides for resistance movements. He explained how to organize cells, communicate secretly, gather intelligence, and conduct operations without being detected. But his most important new writing was something he called the psychology of freedom. In this work, he analyzed why humans seemed naturally resistant to permanent conquest and how other species could develop similar mental strength. "Freedom is not something that others can give you," he wrote. "It is something you must claim for yourself, again and again, every day of your life. The moment you stop fighting for it, even in small ways, it begins to slip away." He described how humans throughout history had maintained their sense of dignity even in the worst conditions. Slaves had preserved their culture through songs and stories. Prisoners had found ways to help each other and maintain hope. Conquered peoples had kept their identities alive through generations of oppression. The tyrants fear us because they know that we can never be completely broken, Ian continued. They can control our bodies, but our minds remain free. Free minds will always find ways to resist. As he wrote, Yen could hear the sounds of the underground network at work around him. In tunnels throughout the abandoned mine, humans were copying his stories, planning operations, and preparing for the larger rebellion that seemed to grow. Closer each day, somewhere above ground. Alien patrols searched for the source of the forbidden writings that were transforming their controlled galaxy into something they no longer recognized. They would never find him, Hyan knew, because he was protected by thousands of people who had learned that courage was contagious and that truth, once unleashed, could not be stopped. His pen moved across the paper, each word another small act of rebellion, another seed that would grow into revolution. The underground network carried his truth to distant worlds. And with each passing day, more beings discovered that freedom was not just a human dream, but a universal birthright that was worth any sacrifice to obtain. The galaxy was waking up, and the hegemony's long night of oppression was finally coming to an end. The explosions echoed across the industrial district of New Seoul as Tae and his resistance fighters struck 3 hegemony supply depots simultaneously. What had started as a small group of factory workers had grown into a coordinated military force of over 200 beings, including humans and several alien species who had joined the rebellion. Tae crouched behind a damaged transport vehicle, watching flames rise from the main weapons storage facility. His team had used tactics straight from Hyan's writings, hitting multiple targets at once to divide the enemy's response. The plan had worked perfectly. Strike Team 3 reports mission complete, his communication specialist announced. All primary targets destroyed. Any casualties on our side? Tae asked. 2 wounded, none dead. The enemy lost at least 30. Soldiers. Tae nodded grimly. Every life lost hurt, but Hyan's writings had taught him that freedom always came with a price. The important thing was to make sure that price meant something, as his teams retreated to their hidden bases. Tae thought about how much had changed since he first read that story about Captain Kim. 6 months ago, he'd been afraid to speak loudly in front of alien supervisors. Now he was leading military operations against the most powerful empire in the galaxy. The transformation had not been easy. Many of his original followers had been captured or killed in earlier raids. But for every fighter they lost, 3 more joined their cause. Hyan's stories had taught them something the hegemony could never understand. Humans did not fight just for themselves, but for an idea of what life could be like when people were truly free on the other side of the galaxy. Mina sat in her apartment reading the latest collection of human writings that had reached the hegemony capital world. She was supposed to be creating propaganda to counter these stories, but instead she found herself completely absorbed in their message. Her latest assignment was particularly difficult. Her supervisor Thex had given her a story called The Children of Vega Prime and ordered her to write an analysis, proving that it was nothing but lies and fantasy. But the more Mina studied the story, the more she believed every word it told about a group of human children who had been separated from their parents during the conquest of their world. Instead of giving up, they had created their own community. In the ruins of their destroyed city, they had learned to find food, treat injuries, protect each other from dangerous animals and hostile aliens. Most remarkably, they had maintained hope. Even after 3 years of living in caves and abandoned buildings, they still believed their parents might return. They still sang the songs their mothers had taught them and told the stories their fathers had shared. They refused to let their humanity die, even when everything else had been taken from them. Mina tried to write the criticism that Thex expected, but the words would not come. How could she attack a story about children who showed such courage and loyalty? How could she help the hegemony destroy people who possessed such beautiful spirits? That evening, she made a decision that would change her life forever. Instead of writing propaganda against the human stories, She began writing the truth about her own experiences working for the hegemony. She described the lies she had been ordered to create, the good people she had helped destroy, and the growing doubt that had been eating at her conscience for months. When she finished writing, she encrypted her confession and sent it to an address that appeared in several of the human stories. She did not know if anyone would receive it, but she felt lighter than she had in years. For the first time in her adult life, she had chosen truth over safety. Commander Zilak stood in the ruins of what had once been a major hegemony military base on the world of Kepler 438c. The attack had been carried out by a mixed force of humans and aliens working together with military precision that impressed even his veteran officers. "How many bases have we lost this month?" he asked his aide. 17 across 4 star systems, sir. The rebels are using coordinated tactics that suggest central planning and communication. Zilak nodded grimly. The human writings were not just inspiring individual acts of rebellion anymore. They were creating an organized resistance movement that spanned multiple worlds and species. Worse, his own troops were beginning to question their orders. Just yesterday, he had been forced to arrest 3 of his soldiers for refusing to fire on a group of peaceful protesters. The protesters had been carrying signs with quotes from human stories, demanding basic rights for all beings in their system. When ordered to disperse them with force, his soldiers had laid down their weapons and walked away. "Sir, his intelligence?" Officer interrupted his thoughts. "We have intercepted communications suggesting a major operation is being planned. The rebels are calling it Operation Starlight. What do we know about it?" "Very little, sir. But it appears to involve simultaneous actions across at least 12 star systems. And the target seems to be our main communication network." Zilak felt a chill run through him. If the rebels could disrupt hegemony communications, they could coordinate resistance activities across the entire galaxy. The scattered uprisings would become a unified revolution. He called an emergency meeting of the Hegemony High Command, the massive conference room filled with military leaders from dozens of worlds, all struggling with the same problem. The human writings had created something none of them had expected, a galaxy-wide movement united by shared ideals rather than military force. "The situation is beyond our control," admitted General Korex, the overall military commander. "Human stories have given our subjects something we cannot defeat with weapons. They have given them hope." "Then we eliminate hope," suggested Admiral Throne. "We find this writer and execute him publicly. We show the galaxy what happens to those who spread such dangerous ideas." "We have been trying to find him for over a year," Korex replied. "He is protected by networks of followers who would rather die than betray him. And even if we found him, killing him would only prove his point about our brutality." Sulak listened to the debate with growing unease. His fellow officers were talking about increasingly desperate measures, including the complete extermination of human populations on several worlds. But Zilak had read enough of the human writings to understand that such actions would only inspire more resistance. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "we should consider that the humans might be right." The room fell silent. Every eye turned toward him, with expressions of shock and anger. "Explain yourself, Commander," General Korex said in a dangerous voice. "The human writings describe a simple concept," Zilak continued, knowing he was risking his career and possibly his life. "They say that beings deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their species. They say that cooperation works better than oppression. Maybe we should try listening to these ideas instead of fighting them." "You are relieved of duty," Korex snapped. "Report to detention for re-education." As guards moved to arrest him, Zilak realized he had made his choice. He would rather face punishment for telling the truth than continue serving a system that thrived on lies and fear. In that moment, he understood why so many beings across the galaxy were willing to risk everything for the vision of freedom that human stories described. Meanwhile, in his underground hiding place, Han worked on his most ambitious project yet. He was writing a comprehensive guide to building a free society, one that would serve as a blueprint for the galaxy that would emerge after the hegemony fell. "Revolution is not enough," he wrote. "Destroying tyranny is only the first step. The harder task is building something better in its place." His new work explained how different species could cooperate as equals, how conflicts could be resolved without violence, and how individual freedom could coexist with community responsibility. It was not just a story about human courage, but a practical manual for creating the kind of galaxy that every being deserved to live in, as he wrote. Reports reached him about uprisings on dozens of worlds. His sister Nari had expanded the distribution network to over 100 star systems. Resistance cells were sharing tactics and coordinating operations across vast distances. Even some alien military units were beginning to defect to the rebel, because the revolution was no longer a dream, but a reality spreading across the galaxy like wildfire. And at its heart were the simple truths that humans had always known: that freedom was worth fighting for, and that every being deserved to live with dignity and hope. The hegemony's days were numbered, and everyone in the galaxy was beginning to understand that change was not just possible, but inevitable. Vex Prime Thalon stood before the massive viewing screen in his command center, watching reports of rebellion pour in from across the galaxy. Red warning lights flashed on star charts as world after world declared independence from hegemony rule. His empire was crumbling, and he knew exactly who to blame. Operation Silent Sky begins now, he announced to his assembled commanders. Every available ship, every loyal soldier, every resource we have will be dedicated to one mission: find the human rider and bring him to me alive. The operation was the largest military action in hegemony history. Thousands of ships spread across hundreds of star systems, searching for the man whose words had ignited a galactic revolution. Phelan had decided that the only way to stop the rebellion was to capture its inspiration and destroy him publicly. But Phelan had underestimated both the size of the resistance network and the determination of humans to protect their heroes. Every world his forces searched was filled with people willing to risk their lives to misdirect the hunters. False leads sent hegemony troops on wild chases across empty space while the real resistance continued to grow stronger. On Kepler 44 to B, June and a team of veteran resistance fighters helped Hayan move to a new hiding place every few days. The old mining tunnels had become too dangerous as hegemony forces intensified their search. Now they moved through a network of safe houses maintained by ordinary humans who had been inspired by Hayan's stories. "You should leave the planet," Nari urged her brother during one of their secret meetings. "The whole galaxy knows your words. Now, you have done enough." Hyun shook his head. "The revolution needs more than just stories about the past. People need to know what comes next, how to build something better than what they are tearing down." He had been working on his masterpiece, a document he called The Foundation of Freedom. It outlined not just how to resist tyranny, but how to create governments that served their people, economies that provided for everyone's needs, in societies where different species could live together in peace. But before he could finish this crucial work, the hegemony found him. The raid came at dawn, with dropships landing around the remote farmhouse where Hyun had been hiding. Hegemony soldiers surrounded the building and demanded surrender. Inside, June and 6 other fighters prepared for a final battle. "There is another way," Hyun said quietly. He looked at the faces of people who had risked everything to protect him, people who would die in the next few minutes unless he acted. "No," June said firmly. "We fight. And accomplish what?" Hyun asked. "You die, I die, and the galaxy loses both the ideas we have already shared and the ones we have yet to create." Before anyone could stop him, Hyun walked to the door and opened it. Outside, 100 hegemony soldiers aimed their weapons at the small farmhouse. Their commander, a tall alien with silver skin and cold blue eyes, stepped forward. "You are the writer they call Hain," the commander said. "I am Hain," replied calmly. "Surrender, and your friends will live." Hyun looked back at June and the others, then nodded. "I surrender." As the soldiers placed restraints on his hands, Hyun felt a strange sense of peace. His words were already spread across the galaxy, copied and translated and memorized by millions of beings. The ideas were more important than the man who wrote them, and ideas could not be captured or killed. Within hours, News of his capture spread through the resistance network. Instead of crushing rebel morale, it had the opposite effect. Human and aliens throughout the galaxy began planning massive demonstrations. Military units that had remained loyal to the hegemony started deserting in large numbers. Even some hegemony officials began publicly questioning the wisdom of persecuting someone whose only crime was writing about freedom and dignity. The trial was broadcast across the galaxy as Thalen intended, but not with the result he expected. Instead of showing a broken man begging for mercy, the proceedings revealed Hyan's calm dignity and unwavering commitment to his principles. "You are charged with sedition, rebellion, and corruption of public order," the prosecutor announced. "How do you respond?" "I am guilty of telling the truth," Hyn replied. "If that is a crime in your empire, then your empire deserves to fall." For 3 days, prosecutors tried to make Hyn admit that his stories were lies designed to cause trouble. For 3 days, he responded with evidence that every story was true, and that the real criminals were those who oppressed innocent beings across the galaxy. On the final day of the trial, Thalen himself took the stand to demand the death penalty. "This human has poisoned the minds of our subjects," the dictator declared. "He has turned loyal citizens into rebels and threatened the stability that has brought peace to the galaxy." "What kind of peace," Hyan asked, when given a chance to respond, "requires that entire species live in slavery? What kind of stability is built on fear and suffering? You call me a criminal, but I have never killed anyone, never destroyed a world, never separated families or stolen freedom from beings who only wanted to live their lives in dignity." "You have destroyed an empire," Thalen shouted. "I have helped beings remember what they were meant to be," Hyn replied quietly. That night, as Hyn sat in his cell waiting for the execution scheduled for the following morning, Mina and Commander Zelok led a coordinated breakout attempt. Zelok had been freed from detention by soldiers who had read Hyan's writings and decided they could no longer serve a tyrannical system. Mina had used her knowledge of hegemony security systems to plan an assault on the most heavily defended prison in the galaxy. The attack began at midnight with explosions throughout the capital city. Resistance cells that had been hidden for months emerged to strike at government buildings, communication centers, and military installations. But the main focus was the prison where Hyan was held. Zelok led a force of defected hegemony soldiers through the prison's outer defenses, while Mina disabled security systems from inside the facility. Fighting was fierce as loyal guards tried to stop the rescue, but the attackers were motivated by something more powerful than duty or fear. They were fighting for the future that Hyan's words had shown them was possible. As explosions echoed through the corridors above him, Hyn continued writing on scraps of paper that had been smuggled into his cell. Even facing death, he wanted to leave behind as much guidance as possible for those who would continue the work of building a free galaxy. When the cell door finally opened, he looked up to see Nari and Tay leading a group of armed rebels. "Time to go, brother," Nari said, with tears in her eyes. "The revolution needs its voice," Tay added. As they fought their way out of the collapsing prison, Hyan realized that something fundamental had changed. He was no longer just a writer hoping to inspire people with stories about human courage. He had become a symbol of the universal desire for freedom that existed in every intelligent being. Behind them, the hegemony capital burned as decades of repressed anger finally exploded into open revolution. Ahead lay the challenges of building something new from the ashes of the old. But for the first time in his life, Hyan believed that freedom was not just a dream, but an achievable reality that was finally within reach. The breaking point had been passed. The age of tyranny was ending, and the age of freedom was about to begin. 6 months after the prison break that had freed Hyan, the hegemony capital world stood empty and silent. The massive government buildings that had once housed the galaxy's most powerful empire were now museums displaying the history of oppression. And the documents that had brought it to an end, Vex Prime Thalen was dead. Not killed in battle, but found alone in his private chambers. Abandoned by followers who had finally seen the truth about the system they had served. His final message, discovered on his personal computer, contained only 3 words: "The humans won." The revolution had succeeded not through military conquest, but through the complete collapse of legitimacy. When enough beings throughout the galaxy stopped believing in the hegemony's right to rule, the empire simply ceased to exist. Soldiers laid down their weapons, administrators walked away from their posts, and entire worlds declared their independence without firing a shot. Now representatives from hundreds of species gathered on the neutral world of New Hope to create something that had never existed before: a galactic government based on cooperation rather than domination. The meetings were difficult, with centuries of mistrust and conflict to overcome, but they were guided by principles that Hyan had outlined in his writings. Every being has the right to live with dignity. Read the first line of the New Galactic Charter. Every species has the right to determine its own destiny. Every world has the right to govern itself according to its own values. As long as those values respect the equal rights of others. He himself served as an advisor to the Constitutional Convention, but he refused any official position in the new government. Writers should remain independent, he explained when offered the role of first president. Power corrupts even the best intentions, and the galaxy needs voices that are free to speak truth regardless of political convenience. Instead, he had established the Academy of Truth on a small planet near the galactic center. The Academy was not a school in the traditional sense, but a place where beings from all species could come to study the principles of freedom, learn about the history of resistance to oppression, and prepare themselves to recognize and oppose tyranny wherever it might emerge. The Academy's library contained not just human stories, but accounts of courage and resistance from every species in the galaxy. Hyan had spent months interviewing aliens who had fought against the hegemony, recording their experiences and preserving their wisdom for future generations. Freedom is not a human invention, he often told his students. It is a universal desire that exists in every intelligent being. Humans simply refused to forget it when others had given up hope. Tay had become one of the Academy's most popular instructors. Teaching courses on practical resistance and community organization, his transformation from frightened factory worker to confident leader inspired students who wondered if they had the courage to stand up for their own beliefs. The hardest part is the first step, he would tell them. Once you decide to act, you discover that you are stronger than you thought, and that others are willing to help you. Nari had founded the Galactic Communication Network, ensuring that information could flow freely between worlds without government censorship or corporate control. Her smuggling skills had proven invaluable in creating hidden channels that could not be monitored or shut down by any authority. Dictators fear the free exchange of ideas more than they fear weapons. She explained to the engineers who maintained the network, "Keep the channels open, and tyranny cannot take root." Mina had written the definitive history of the hegemony's fall, combining her insider knowledge with extensive interviews of resistance fighters throughout the galaxy. Her book, The Truth Revolution, became required reading in schools on hundreds of worlds. The hegemony did not fall because humans are superior to other species, she wrote in the conclusion. It fell because one human reminded everyone what they had always known but had been afraid to say. Freedom is worth fighting for, dignity is worth preserving, and truth is more powerful than any weapon. Commander Zilak had helped design the new galactic military, a volunteer force dedicated to protecting member worlds from external threats, strictly forbidden from interfering in their internal affairs. The military's motto, taken from one of Hyan's essays, was strength in service, honor in truth. Scholar Yenth had published his research on human psychology, but with a new conclusion that surprised even him. Humans do not possess any unique genetic advantages, he wrote. Their strength comes from their culture, their stories, and their refusal to accept that suffering is inevitable. These are things that any species can learn, but perhaps the most important change was happening in schools throughout the galaxy. Children who had grown up under the hegemony were learning for the first time about their own histories, their own heroes, and their own traditions. Human stories were studied alongside the liberation tales of dozens of other species, creating a generation that understood both the value of diversity and the universal nature of the desire for freedom. On the 5th anniversary of the hegemony's fall, Hyan stood before a gathering of students at the Academy of Truth. He was older now, his hair gray and his face lined with years of hard work. But his eyes still held the spark that had ignited a galactic revolution. "You often ask me what the secret was," he began. "How did simple stories bring down the most powerful empire in galactic history? The answer is that they were not simple stories. They were complex truths about the nature of freedom and the responsibility that comes with it." He gestured toward the diverse group of beings seated before him, humans and aliens working together to understand the principles of justice and liberty. "The hegemony fell because it was built on lies," he continued. "They told beings that freedom was impossible, that cooperation between species was a dream, individual dignity was less important than collective order. But deep in their hearts, everyone knew these things were false." A young alien student raised her hand. "Oh, but how do we make sure it never happens again? How do we prevent new tyrants from taking power?" Hune smiled. It was the most important question they could ask. "By remembering," he said. "By preserving these stories and telling new ones. By teaching your children that freedom is not a gift that others give you, but a responsibility you must claim for yourself every day. By staying vigilant and speaking truth, even when it is dangerous to do so." He looked out at the stars visible through the Academy's great dome. Somewhere among those distant suns, new challenges were emerging and new generations were growing up. Some would face hardships that required courage. Others would have to choose between safety and principles. All would need the wisdom that came from understanding their own history and the woe experiences of others who had faced similar choices. "The revolution is never finished," Heian concluded. "Each generation must win its own freedom, fight its own battles against oppression, and preserve the truth for those who come after. That is the real human gift to the galaxy, not our strength or our stubbornness, but our understanding that freedom is worth any price and that truth once spoken can never be completely silenced." As the students filed out to continue their studies, Heian returned to his writing. There were always new stories to tell, new truths to preserve, new challenges to address. The galaxy was free, but freedom required constant vigilance and endless effort to maintain. Outside his window, ships from dozens of worlds came and went, carrying trade goods and passengers, ideas and dreams. It was the galaxy that his words had helped to create, a place where beings could travel freely, speak openly, and live according to their own values. It was not perfect. There were still conflicts to resolve, injustices to address, and problems to solve, but it was a place where such challenges could be met through cooperation rather than conquest. Through discussion rather than domination, Heian picked up his pen and began to write. There would always be more work to do, more truths to tell, more stories to preserve. The revolution had succeeded, but the real work, the work of building and maintaining a free society, was just beginning. The tyrants had fallen, the truth had triumphed. Now came the greatest challenge of all, proving that beings from across the galaxy could work together to create something better than what they had destroyed. It was a challenge worthy of the human spirit, and of every other species that had learned that freedom was not just a dream, but a reality that could be achieved by those brave enough to fight for it.